Hey guys, it's Multiplier. We're Plugin Boutique having a look at this thing called the riser. It's basically a plugin that allows us to make those rises and falls that you hear all the time in dance music. So we're going to make one for ourselves. And the final result sounds a little bit like this. So now that we know what we're aiming towards, let's in fact show you how we put it together using the riser. So how does it work? Well, it's a little bit different to the way that normal synths work, because normally if you have a synth and you press a particular note, say C2 or D3 or whatever other note you want to press, it will play that corresponding note at that corresponding frequency. But instead, the way the riser works is the note you press on the keyboard essentially determines how long the rise will be. So if you press A0 or B0, it'll be 16 bars long. And then if you do any note between C1 and B1, that'll be 8 bars. Anything between C2 and B2 will be 4 bars, and so on. So as you move up the keyboard, it gets progressively shorter. So for example, if I press a high note on the keyboard, or a medium note, and so on, depending on where you're on the keyboard, that determines the length. But let's actually make our own sound. So the way in which riser works is we have 3 generators. We have a sweep, we have a noise, and a chord, and then we do various sets of processing to it. So we can focus in on any particular component or any particular generator by pulling down the level of the other generators. And now, because we've pulled down the level of the noise and the chord, we can focus in on this sweep, for example. And then what we have is 3 sets of modulations which control 3 different things. So we have a modulation here that controls volume, which we can determine the way in which this modulation happens. We can pull the start position up and down. We can even give it a bit of curve just by pulling on it up or down. And then we have the frequency, so we can set the start and the end frequency for our sound. Again, you've got all the same controls over the modulations. We can give it a nice curve maybe. Which is pretty cool. But then we can also take things one step further. We can actually determine the start and the end frequency down to a particular note, so we can get it in key with our track. So if we hop into notes by hitting notes, then we can drag this around and look at the top and choose an appropriate start and finish value. So I think something like E1. So if we hold down Command, we can get really precise. E1 to maybe E4 will be quite cool. So hold down Command to get more precise. E1 to E4. And then the final thing we have modulation control over in terms of this sweep is what's called oscillator shape, or it's just a character of the sound basically. So if we change it up to maybe the top down, here it's got a different sound than if it's at the bottom. But if we choose a different oscillator altogether, we can get a different sound. So we can change it from saw multi to maybe saw sync, which should be a little bit harsher. We can choose a nice position. I don't like that. Let's try square multi. That's cool, but maybe we'll go down and up with the oscillator. Perfect. So that's our sweep, and we have a similar set of controls for the next generator, which is the noise. So we'll turn down the sweep temporarily so we can focus in on what the noise is doing, turn up the level. And the way in which noise works is it's nice and simple. We have this shape parameter in the middle. If it's right at the top, it's like white noise. Oh, at the moment there's basically going through the filter, as we can see with this filter, so we'll turn that off for now. So that's our white noise sound. And then if we pull down, the further down in this shape, the more it is like a cymbally, shimmery sort of sound. So we'll choose something we like. Maybe I think that should be cool. Give it a little bit of curve. And we can also change the pitch, and I want the pitch to come down, so we'll put it down like that. maybe shape slightly shimmery. Perfect. And now we have those two generators. We're going to leave chord for now. We don't want to make it overly complicated for this particular video. So we'll drag up the level of the sweep again and dial in the respective levels. I think that's pretty cool. And now we have the basis of our sound generated. We can do things like do some filter modulation. The filters work just as you'd expect in terms of choosing a different filter. So at the moment it's on LP4, which is a medium to steep low pass filter. It's a 4-pole low pass, i.e. it's got a 24 dB attenuation. You can choose a different one if you like, but for this particular thing we're making, I quite like what a medium to steep low pass sounds like, so we'll leave it on LP4. And then again we have these modulations that we can dial in, so we can play with a cutoff start end position and maybe give it a bit of a curve, something like that. Maybe ease off on the resonance modulation as well, so we'll see how that sounds. Oh, at the moment we're not hearing it because we haven't in fact routed the generators into the filter. So we can do that by hitting the filter buttons here, so filter and filter. And there you go, you can hear the effect of the filter modulation. Sounds pretty cool, right? And then what we can do is add a few more effects and do a bit of low frequency modulation. Again, it's up to us how much processing and how much complicatedness, for lack of a better word, we do to our sound. So we're going to do a little bit. We're not going to make it too over the top. So we're going to change the reverb a little bit. So at the moment it's on Hall. We're going to crank up the mix so we can hear quite a lot more of that reverb, which puts it in a nice big space. And we're going to change it to Stadium, which is a little bit bigger. There is a little bit of delay at the moment. We can see with this, we can see there's a delay of 1/8. Let's change that to, I think, a proper 1/8. And the mix is quite low, but that's quite nice like that. I think maybe just a tiny bit more so we can hear it a little bit more after our rise finishes. Perfect. And now finally, let's do a little bit of low frequency modulation or low frequency oscillation. And there's two forms of this. There is the general quote unquote pumper, which is this guy over here. This is almost like your sidechain compression. So again, it's quite common in dance music to have a nice big pump on your riser, which you can either do with sidechain compression in your project file, or you can program it into your actual sound. So let's program it into our actual sound. So we'll choose something a bit nicer, maybe a quarter, which will make it feel exactly like sidechain compression, although we could choose a different division if we want. So we'll play our note, maybe a medium length rise, and dial in this depth. I think I want it quite obvious, so maybe around here. And there you go, we have a sidechain effect programmed in without having to do any complicated routings or further processing. And finally, let's give it a little bit of low frequency oscillation just to demonstrate the power of it. And we can do this in one of two ways. We either have LFO-A or LFO-B. Now, LFO-A isn't synced up to your grid, it isn't synced up to the tempo of your track. The flip side of that is it means we can modulate the rate. So you can see here we have a modulation on the rate. So we can make the rate start at a lower amount and get higher and higher and higher as we go through our rise. Or we can have LFO-B with a fixed rate, which we can determine with this rate here. And then, yeah, that's synced up to our actual track. So I think in this particular example, it'd be quite cool to use LFO-A because I think it'd be quite nice if we map that quite subtly to the frequency of the main sweep generator. So to do that, it is as simple as going to frequency under the generator bit and pulling this parameter slightly to the right. So if I do a medium length rise, the further I go, the more modulated it is. But we want it quite subtle, so we'll put it just off center. Slightly further back. In fact, we can probably leave it in the middle, but then play around with this depth. So if we pull down the final depth to about there, and we want it to start off a lot lower, and I think the rate modulation is good, so we'll try this now. Sounds pretty good to me, maybe slightly less wobbly, so pull back on it slightly. I like that, it's nice and subtle. Because we have the depth starting off at 0, then we don't hear any of this LFO modulation on the frequency when the rise starts. But as the rise moves through, it starts to come in and gives it almost like a vibrato effect. It sounds pretty cool, I think. And it's worth noting in terms of what we can actually modulate. We can modulate most things, to be honest. Everywhere we see one of these sliders with an A or a B to the right or the left-hand side, we can modulate that with an LFO. So by default, all these will be mapped to LFO A, but if we wanted to, for example, say for this frequency that we're modulating here, if we wanted LFO B to modulate it instead, all we'd have to do is click B, and now all of a sudden it's this LFO B that's modulating the frequency, not LFO A. So in that particular example, it was LFO B with a 3/16 division, and that was doing your modulation. But let's put it back to A. One final little thing, we will crank up the width very slightly on the master down in the bottom right. And there you go, that is our sound. I've been Multiplier, hope you enjoyed.